shift, the stakes are high. The Mag breaks it down, no need to sigh. From EU rules to global news, Reg with Meg, your trusted views.
Welcome back to Reg with Meg, the podcast where we deliver regulatory news and share insights from medical device and IVD manufacturers. Today, we welcome Dean Adair, MedEnvoy's regulatory affairs consultant, who has been with MedEnvoy since January 2023. Dean, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Right. So I'm just going to dive right in and ask you my first question that I have for you. Now that RAPS Euro Convergence is over, what were your biggest takeaways from the event?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Good place to start. I think the conference this year not only gives you a sense of the topical themes at the moment, which I think we are going to cover a little bit later, but it really highlighted the importance of the different industry stakeholders coming together to discuss these things. What is working right now within the EU regulatory landscape and what is not working? What can we learn from other regulators and the approaches that are taken in other markets? So I think many of the talks that we saw were kind of quite introspective in this sense. We have a little bit of soul searching taking place amongst the regulators and just a general kind of viewing the status quo fairly critically. I think, a regulator isn't necessarily going to have the same starting point as an innovator or a manufacturer, but you somehow need to bring those two perspectives together to implement something that makes sense whilst also maintaining, your overall goal of bringing safe and effective devices to market for the patients that are out there. So I think that the overall sense is that the balance is really not there right now in Europe, and at least there seems to be agreement on that. So I think that this year's conference did quite a good job of bringing different views together on that topic. We do have still some way to go in terms of implementation of change, but I think that is definitely something that is actually starting to happen right now. So we do have reason to be optimistic about that. And I think that was probably the biggest takeaway from the conference that I got.
Nice. I'm glad that there's change on the horizon. Like diving into that, were there any regulatory topics or industry trends that came up repeatedly throughout the conference?
Yes, absolutely. So kind of following a similar vein to what we were just saying, I think the first thing to mention is the European Commission's proposal to what they call simplify the MDR and the IVDR, or so-called MDR, IVDR 2.0. So this really is an active, ongoing effort to address challenges that manufacturers have been facing with the MDR and IVDR essentially since it came into force. And this includes, well-known challenges like the administrative burden of compliance, cost efficiency, and predictability of the regulation and how it actually applies to these different manufacturers depending on their situation. So revision of the regulation has been based on a consultation process, and we haven't actually had any changes to the law, but this proposal from the Commission is really something that they're going to be looking at very, very soon. And one of the ways that they can improve the situation is to make pathways for market access a lot clearer for manufacturers. And this is a little bit murky right now, particularly when you're comparing the approach in the United States, for example. So it can be a particularly challenging environment for small and medium-sized businesses who we have seen decide to withdraw their products from market. And that's something that we're really trying to change. We've also seen that the requirements can be implemented quite differently between the national competent authorities and notified bodies and ARs in the space, and that this lack of consistency and kind of fragmentation creates a lot of uncertainty. So there were a lot of discussions around that and how we can increase the alignment between the different stakeholders in the industry, particularly in Europe. So, a notified body telling you one thing regarding compliance when a competent authority is telling you another thing is obviously not very helpful. Yeah, we really want to see the requirements under the MDR and IVDR being proportionate to the actual risks that are posed by the devices. And sometimes you need real world data to understand all the risks. You can't necessarily anticipate all of this in advance. So how do you kind of balance that with the safety and effectiveness? That is the ultimate goal. So a number of measures have actually been proposed in this revision or MDR IVDR 2.0. And this includes reclassification of certain devices to actually lower their classification, also reducing the burden during the certification process, and increasing transparency about the notified body fees. So implementing actually a consistent fee structure for the notified bodies that is overseen by the Commission. They're also looking at lengthening periodic reporting requirements. For example, periodic safety update reports. They're looking to lengthen the time in which you need to actually report that information. They're also looking to digitalize compliance tools and, again, as I mentioned, facilitate this kind of alignment between the different stakeholders. So we're certainly looking at steps in the right direction, I think, with this proposal in order to implement a more balanced, proportionate, and internationally competitive regime in Europe. So I guess the other recurring theme, of course, artificial intelligence is really coming to the forefront. I think
Right.
in many industries around the world.
Right.
And I mean, we're not just talking about AI-enabled medical devices anymore. So not just medical devices that incorporate AI in some way, but we are talking about AI as a medical device.
Oh, wow.
Where AI is really being used to perform, all of the kind of the functions that lead to the clinical outcomes that you want for your patient.
My
Um,
goodness.
yeah, so that's for sure. That's something that really, really, really rapidly evolving there. But also, we also want to think about how we can use AI as regulatory professionals in the space. What we really see this year compared to last year is actually just how powerful the AI models are becoming. And even in the conference next year, it really is going to be a completely different story. So how can we leverage that when it's actually becoming to the point where you can implement these things cautiously and on some kind of practical way. So an
Mhm.
example of this is stakeholders like the notified body using this technology to kind of automate and streamline their conformity assessments for manufacturers when they're issuing certificates. And this kind of sounded like fantasy a few years ago, but it's really on the horizon. These kind of purpose-built AI models designed specifically for compliance. So I'm not talking about going to a public version of a general purpose AI model, but really AI models that are built specifically for compliance purposes and validated specifically for these purposes. And there's really huge potential with these kinds of technologies, and that came up quite a lot during the conference. Of course, we need to balance all of this excitement with considering the risks. How do you control this? You kind of we often think of the kind of the black box that is associated with AI. You can't really see exactly the steps to reasoning, but we have to understand this is kind of a feature of the system rather than a bug. So how do you deal with that? And one of the ways that came out of the discussions is to implement a kind of continuous validation of the system. So instead of validating it once or validating it on an annual basis, you're kind of doing this continuously in real time to ensure that the parameters are staying consistent with what you require from the output of the model, and that the model is not drifting, or especially in the case of models that are intended to be autonomous, their output isn't drifting in a way that you don't want. Yeah, in terms of the medical devices out there right now that are actually incorporating AI, there was some information at the conference that these are currently focused on radiological applications. So these are the devices that have actually been approved from the notified bodies. A large number of them are used for, detecting lesions in radiology through MRI and CT scans. So,
Mhm.
um, going forward, you're probably going to see, of course, wider applications in terms of what is actually getting certified. Yeah, so I think, we really need to become more literate in AI. It's been phrased at the conference as not really an optional thing that you look at if you want to, but it's really becoming necessary to consider how this is impacting the space and how we can leverage it in a responsible way. So yeah, we absolutely need to be keeping up with that.
Wow, so AI, MDR, IVR 2.0, which actually that latter one surprised me. I didn't know they were even working on that. So I was like, "Oh, but it makes sense." A lot of people
Yeah,
struggle with
yeah,
it.
they have for sure gotten a lot of let's call it constructive feedback from a lot of manufacturers over the last couple of years. So yeah, and the proposals that are out there right now they're making a lot of sense, I think. So we really do need to see. Honestly, the next 6 months, I think we'll have a lot more information about this.
That's gonna be interesting. We already got, like, UTAMED deadline coming up. We got Swissamed, and then in the future, MDR 2.0. So you kinda answered the other couple of questions, which we had
Getting ahead of
MDR,
myself.
IVDR, AI, and digital health. I guess I could move on to the particular presentation panel speaker that really stood out to you, at the conference.
Yeah, I mean, there were a lot of quite good talks at the conference for sure. Talks ranging from post-market surveillance, more on clinical evidence requirements. But I actually quite enjoyed the presentation that was on actually to get a little bit away from the EU for a second, that was on the FDA's new quality management system regulation, um, because this is something that is an active, ongoing requirement. It came into force, I believe, February 2nd of 2026, and this is kind of FDA's approach to the quality system requirements in the United States. And a large part of that is that they are aligning the requirements a lot with ISO 13485, although it's not a complete alignment. So the session was actually quite valuable to provide insight into developments and challenges that you see not just in the EU market, and kind of allows you to look at them in a bit of a comparative light. So the representative from FDA, Keisha Thomas, she spoke about really the gaps that manufacturers are currently experiencing in their transition to the new quality management system regulation. And it seems that some out there are still struggling with this a little bit. They may think that complying with ISO 13485 is automatic compliance with the new requirements. And while it does get you a lot of the way there are also FDA specific requirements to consider. So it's really important to do that kind of stage zero gap analysis of your own quality system and where the gaps are. And in terms of the specific areas where manufacturers are currently struggling with this, it appears to be largely the product realization clauses of the 13485 standard and measurement analysis and improvement requirements. So this means that manufacturers haven't really been adequately documenting their risk management processes or the required elements when they're designing and developing their products. And the procedures are kind of lacking for supplier selection and monitoring, and justifications for not investigating complaints are sometimes not in place, or the complaint data analysis is incomplete. So I think that talk was in particular very valuable for me and for also those manufacturers out there who are still trying to grapple with these new requirements.
Nice. I know you guys are especially happy about the FDA aligning more with ISO 13485 in the regulatory
Yeah,
standards.
right. Yeah,
Makes
that's
it
what
probably
that's what
easier.
you want. Yeah, you want the international harmonization, of course, as much as you can. So yeah, that's also just I think, a very logical thing to do.
Nice. Next question I have for you. What concerns or priorities are companies, manufacturers in Europe talking about the most right now when it comes to the compliance? Like, what did you see at the conference that that they had on their mind?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is an interesting one because I think what was on a lot of people's minds, especially the manufacturers, is of course, as we mentioned, the device registration, the mandatory use that is coming into play later this year. But there wasn't a whole lot of actual conference talks on that, although I spoke with a lot of manufacturers that were concerned about that. So I thought that was quite interesting. Maybe a little bit more transparency or discussion around that topic is needed. Just not because I suppose it's maybe not as relevant to someone who's not a manufacturer. Of course, for authorized representatives, it is. So yeah, I think that it's very important that manufacturers are looking at this internally and with their authorized representatives to ensure that these timelines are going to be met and that there is no interruption to supply. Manufacturers, they're still quite concerned, I think, with the cost of compliance in Europe. It's very difficult to project how much it's going to cost to bring your device to market, which is a huge barrier to entry. Particularly for those smaller businesses out there. Yeah, how can you make your compliance strategy the most efficient for the different markets that you want to enter globally? What is the best market to go to first? How can you leverage data or approvals from that market for other submissions? Yeah, how does that interact with your specific patient population and clinical evidence requirements? So I think that regulators, such as those in Canada, Australia, the UK, and the EU, are also making steps towards trying to address that.
Nice. So, from a business perspective, these same companies, what do you think they should be paying closer attention to after this event?
Yeah, again, we should really be looking for, of course, the updates on the MDR, IVDR 2.0. Really try and stay informed about what is actually going to change, how that impacts your business, and how you can plan for what is hopefully going to be a much easier time going forward. And in that vein, also looking towards streamlining, your compliance methods and technical documentation creation, through digitalization. That's of course very, very important. You can save a huge amount of time on kind of administrative things that you may not even realize that you're spending so much time on. Yeah, and I mean, of course, AI, but also, yeah, I think treating that in quite a cautious and responsible way by implementing, again, as I've mentioned, the ongoing validation policy, and of course, maintaining a human in the loop. That's also very important right now.
Right, that makes sense. Overall, what was the mood or sentiment among attendees this year? Would you say people were optimistic about upcoming changes, like with the MDR 2.0, or did they feel cautious or overwhelmed by some of the other stuff like AI, for instance, that's coming up in the pipeline?
Yeah, I think all of the above, maybe at different times. So
Hmm.
yeah, I mean, I think it's a bit of it seems like, yeah, a bit of a rethink is taking place in the space, which can be overwhelming, but is also cause for optimism. So it seems that we really are coming to a time of real change and not just talking about it. Yeah, we also want to be cautious and not repeat potential errors or mistakes or inefficiencies that have been created in the past. So yeah, I would say that, yeah, different mood depending on depending on the time of day or which point in the process you're at. But overall, cause for optimism.
Okay, optimism, cautious,
We like
overwhelmed,
that, right?
mixed bag, all three. That makes sense though.
It's
That
always
does
going to
make
be a mixed
sense.
bag.
Yeah, like that does make sense because some of the topics can, depending on the person, be controversial or they have their opinions on it that might not be so favorable
Yeah, yeah. Yeah,
towards
or
them.
you did for sure see some divergent opinions coming out, which was really nice, but also very respectable debates at the same time.
All right, so to wrap all this up, for the companies, manufacturers that couldn't attend RAPS Euro Convergence, what are the top 2 to 3 things they should know coming out of the event?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think again, as we mentioned, paying attention to the changes that are taking place in the space right now. So really subscribe to all the newsletters that you can. Keep informed of all of the upcoming deadlines when it comes to mandatory ongoing requirements, but also when we are expected to hear more things, from the Commission on a lot of the topics that we were discussing. And yeah, I mean, we also want to be looking at the simplification process. I think if you have a device that incorporates or is based on AI, how the upcoming AI Act and the deadlines that are associated with that and how that interacts specifically with the MDR. There's also a push to really simplify the requirements where they are overlapping. So for sure, if you are an AI-based software manufacturer, then that's something that you also really want to be looking at.
Right. Excellent. Well, that's all the time we have for today. I want to give a special thank you to Dean for joining us again today and sharing his insights on this year's RAPS Euro Convergence. And if you want to stay up to date with regulatory news, follow us on our Spotify for future episodes. We always have a new episode up weekly. Until next time, stay informed and stay compliant. Bye, guys.